and welcome to this episode of the Cruzamento Podcast. We are really happy to record this episode in English. In today's show, we will talk about the intersection of technology, healthcare, and sustainability. My name is Daniel Gdelha, and together with me is my friend and co-host, André Correia.
Hello and welcome to another show of Cruzamento Podcast. Today, we are very pleased to have with us our guest, Nelson Jordan. Hello, Nelson. Very welcome to this new season of the podcast. Nelson, our very first question, very usual question. In 30 seconds, who is Nelson Jordan?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. Really good to be here. I'm one of the co-founders of Avenue. We're a Web3 collaboration platform. We'll talk more about what that means in the future. I'm also one of the past leaders of a DAO, which we'll talk about as well, called DAO Masters, which I helped lead for 4 seasons.
Okay, excellent, Nelson. So maybe let's start with the basics. DAOs, Decentralized Autonomous Organization. Can you explain what is this all about and how does it differ from a traditional organization?
Of course. So the things that it has in common with an organization in the traditional sense is that it's a group of people that come together for a specific mission because they believe in similar things. Where it differs from traditional organizations is in some of the acronyms that you mentioned. So the decentralized part, instead of the centralized ownership and decision-making, it means that financial ownership, decision-making, and the way we record information is done in a decentralized manner, which means instead of it being one person or just a small amount of people, it tends to be more.
And let's get to concrete examples to try to visualize a little bit better the concept, Nelson. Can you give 2-3 examples of the most relevant and well-known DAOs and its practical application as well? And if you could relate to these to some industries, that would be great as well.
Of course. So to touch a little bit more on what a DAO is and then to give examples, I would say it's a group of people with a similar mission in mind who come together to take decisions together, to own their results and to kind of make some impact on the world. So some concrete examples of that from lots of different spaces. We have MoonDAO. MoonDAO wants to get people on the moon and into space, and they've successfully put somebody into space, which was fantastic. So they pulled their capital together. They bought a popular YouTuber a ticket on Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin and fired them off into space. That's one particular example.
And Nelson,
another kind of
shortly reflecting on, so MoonDAO, it's a company, or?
No, it's a DAO.
Okay.
So it's a group of people that thought this particular idea was super cool, and they were willing to deploy their own capital, give their own money to make this happen because they thought it was a good idea.
Excellent. Okay.
So another example would be Constitution DAO. This was covered in the media quite well, so hopefully some of your listeners will know it. But a copy of the Constitution fairly recently came up for auction. And again, a bunch of people thought it would be a great idea to pool their capital so that they could all be part owners of a copy of the American Constitution. Unfortunately, they lost. I think they raised, I think it was $40 million or something together. Unfortunately, they were outbid at the last minute. But it showed kind of that people can come together, and if they have a defining mission that they all believe in, great things can happen. But we have examples from, every possible industry that you can imagine. There's probably some sort of DAO working on making it happen right now.
That's really, really cool, Nelson, because it's a different way to look at organizations, namely at the decision-making process. So for our listeners, what are the key benefits of a DAO and how can it improve the decision-making process? And can you talk about, for example, the role of blockchain, which we suspect there is a role there, technology in the functioning of a DAO in decision-making as well?
Sure. So let's start with the blockchain part. And I've purposely left that out because it can be a bit of a stopping point in conversations for sometimes because it seems like it's getting too technical. But essentially, the way that we record ownership, the way that we ensure decentralization, and the way that we record our decisions and even take decisions happens via a blockchain. So a blockchain is essentially a shared ledger that people can see information on, right? So there's a certain transparency, and the way it's recorded means that it's almost impossible to change the information, which isn't the case for centralized entities.
Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned the fact that blockchain was left a little bit out because it's a showstopper for some of these conversations. I think it is actually a brilliant topic for conversation, and but it is also a very complex one, right? And this is maybe why you were referring that some people are being a bit put off with the conversation. So. These technologies are complex, are in the definitions themselves as well. Having a group of people collecting money to bring someone into the moon, right? It's actually not. It's a very complex idea to think of, right? So often we observe brilliant technical ideas that are very difficult to translate to general public in a way that everyone really understands them. So there is this common mission, which is great, but then they also need to understand how all works and how it will fit together. And to adopt it, right? So can you please tell us how you look at these challenges, and what is the best way to translate this complex technology and ideas into simple language that everyone can understand and adopt? Because at the end of the day, you need people to adopt, right?
I think the key is use cases. It's a lot easier for people to understand specific, concrete examples. So if we talk about, sustainability, for example, there might be an organization that comes together because they believe that carbon credits are the future, as an example. So you leave the part about blockchain to be the secondary part. That's how it's executed. That's how everything actually works. But the most important thing is getting people together who believe in that mission. So I think just illustrating use cases is going to help bring more people on. I think the second part of it is kind of called like abstraction. I'm not sure if it's definitely this, but this is how I think of it. So in the same way that people right now using the internet don't need to know how a router works, they don't need to know anything about IP addresses or anything like that. They don't need to know how email works because we have interfaces that make that really easy. Where we are in terms of Web3 right now is on the cusp of that. So, 10 years ago, obviously this concept of Bitcoin, which the first blockchain was invented. And for the last 10 years, it's been incredibly technical. I wouldn't have found my own place in this space back then because I'm a non-technical co-founder. It was only until these changes started happening that we were like, okay, well, the technology is now in a state where it works, and it's getting better every single day. Now we need to almost abstract that technological aspect and that complexity away and ensure that users just have something that works and that is understandable and the user experience is super clear, and the security issues as well. We have some work to do on those. Just don't interfere with uptake of potential users.
And just a follow-up question there, Nelson, you are talking about a user interface to kind of almost hides in a good way, by the way, the technology, so the technology can work for the users. But you also mentioned that these are communities with, I imagine, very large amount of people. So how do you work out the user interface for all these people to come together and actually, gather 14 million, as you were mentioning before?
Definitely. So right now, that's something that the industry itself is struggling with and coming to terms with. And the great thing about Web3 is that everyone has slightly different ideas about how to approach it. And everybody is madly experimenting and iterating right now on the way that they think it should be run. So lots of communities themselves, at least the social aspect, are run on Discord. That's the most common. In terms of the what we actually use to record votes, and by record I mean store those results on chain and using tokens which all the different participants have to record their votes and to say, hey, I believe this. Okay, we're using something called Snapshot. So we have all of these different tools floating about, and there's a lot of fragmentation in the market. What we're building right now at Avenue is a way that instead of these communities existing in silos and not being able to talk to each other, is a way of all of these contributors and all of these communities being able to move themselves forward, but also communicate to each other. So to be quite frank, you asked how it's happening right now. In a lot of cases, it's not, it's happening in individual communities who kind of figure it out and iterate and try and improve themselves. But as an ecosystem, there's lots of individual experiments going on, and we need something that brings them all together.
Interesting. That's really, really interesting. And maybe Nelson, going and picking here on the use cases, as you said, it's important for people to understand. And one of the topics of our podcast is the healthcare. And I'm pretty sure there are several use cases in looking at this particular healthcare space. Can you please give us 2 examples, real cases where DAO is really getting into?
Yeah, of course. So healthcare, for me, at least healthcare research, sits under a broader topic called DeSci, which is decentralized science. So right now, science suffers from several problems, particularly the research side, in terms of institutions control how it happens. That can be academic institutions, that can be research-based institutions, and basically they have their own priorities, right? But the beauty of decentralized science and then healthcare within that means that the people that are most affected by these issues can come together and work out the best way of approaching those issues. So, for example, if you suffer from a disease that is very, very rare, healthcare organizations aren't necessarily, and I'm talking about traditional organizations here, they're not necessarily going to prioritize that. Not because they're, uncaring or unsympathetic or anything like that, but from a profitability standpoint, it might not make sense to spend their time and money on that if the total addressable market for that potential cure or relief from the disease isn't very large. But that doesn't mean that for those individuals, that isn't incredibly important. So what they can do is pull their money together. They can bring in individual researchers or teams of researchers to work on this, and they can fund those, and they can fund the research, and they can even fund the manufacture as well. So we have larger organizations that are supported as well by traditional organizations, because many traditional organizations believe that this is also part of the future. So we have Vita DAO being an excellent example out of a DAO that deploys funding from traditional organizations into these Web3 experiments in decentralized science. Then you have more specific DAOs that operate within healthcare. I believe you've had Inesh on your podcast before. She is very deeply involved with Athena DAO. Athena DAO are all about understanding like female reproductive healthcare. So that is something that there are a lot of problems with in the traditional healthcare space right now. Several drugs out there and research studies don't use women as study participants, so because
trials, right?
Yes, they have too many confounding variables, and I put that in quotation marks. But this is what I've been told as to why they're not included. But people that care about that can come together. They can decide, this is my priority as a woman or as a supporter of women's reproductive rights, and to say, this needs more focus. Let's be the ones that focus on that. We can't, rely on traditional organizations to have our best interests at heart. Or because this doesn't make sense from a business perspective, a financial perspective to address. So we're going to have to do it ourselves.
That's super interesting, Nelson. It kind of comes to my mind, democracy 3.0 or 5.0, whatever, right? So that is no longer only in the hands of public or private institutions to decide a strategy where to go and to invest, but in our hands of every citizen. Is it a right way to think about it, Nelson?
Exactly. And it's happening in every space that I can imagine. It's happening in products, it's happening in media, it's happening in development, it's happening in science, it's happening in physical locations. You only need to look at organizations like Cabin, organizations like CityDAO, who are trying to create decentralized cities full of people who believe the same things, and they don't need to be connected in the physical sense and located next to each other. What they can do is create these pods of similar thinkers all over the world and try and propagate their beliefs.
And it is very interesting that we are talking about the society. We are talking about, you've talked about traditional organizations and the DAOs all working together. So the ecosystem here is required to come together to co-create and co-innovate to move us further. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, the important thing to remember is that organizations are just groups of people. And sometimes they're, more centralized in the traditional sense. Sometimes they're more decentralized. They're just groups of people. I suppose the differences are that with DAOs and kind of other Web3 organizations, we can use smart contracts. Smart contracts we haven't talked about in this conversation yet.
Do you want to go a little bit into that? No.
I will give a very, very high level understanding just for this conversation. But in the traditional world, you have to kind of rely on organizations or people holding to their word. You have to have an element of trust there. Essentially, smart contracts are things that execute automatically if a set of criteria occur, and they basically transform that from an environment where you have to trust people, and sometimes there isn't an environment where you can trust people, to more of a trustless or less trust environment, so that you can assure that these things do happen, which is a great way of aligning incentives and making sure that everybody knows the outcomes.
In fact, these technologies can even go broader than the DAOs, even into traditional organizations. I'm thinking about insurance companies, for example. So, but when we talk about these, Nelson, it comes to mind inevitably the cybersecurity side of things, right? So, and here, this is one of the questions we would like to ask you is, can you tell us a little bit more about the security challenges that you face? And you mentioned the blockchain, smart contracts, etc. And how can they be mitigated and addressed?
First, I'll caveat this by saying I'm no security expert, so I can just talk about the things that I've encountered in this ecosystem. So the way I think about security is on an individual level, on an organizational level and on kind of a system-wide level, I guess I would call it. On the individual level, the way that we interact with others in this ecosystem and with apps and with the blockchains themselves are via wallets most of the time. So a wallet isn't, like it is in the same sense in the physical world. It doesn't literally contain our money, but it contains a way of demonstrating who owns our money, who owns those tokens, right? That's kind of the simplest way to think about it without getting into the technicalities. So the issue is there that individual wallets can be hacked. You can, there's lots of different ways of doing this, but you can sign a transaction that does something that you didn't expect it to do. And you can find that your wallet has been drained. There are more traditional hacking techniques as well, such as, requiring or requesting people that give up their seed phrase, which is basically a way of accessing the wallet. So that's kind of the individual level, right? And I think the user interface there is improving daily to make that happen less and less. So there are tools out there right now that are being developed that means that transactions, when they appear right now, appear in the form of code, which are incomprehensible to 99% of us. So tools that transform that code into actually understandable words that the general population will understand about what will happen if you sign this. So that's one of the ways that it's happening, right? There are other ways, such as using cold wallets and warm wallets or hot wallets, which also minimize the risk. And that's about where you actually keep your money. And that's about using only hot wallets for interacting and cold wallets for storage. So that's kind of the individual level, right? But then you have different attack vectors on the organization or on the system level. Anytime you pool capital, that becomes a really, really interesting target for a hacker. And in a lot of these cases, we're talking about a lot of money. In some cases, we're talking about hundreds of millions stored, and accessible via smart contracts. Again, don't fry me, anybody out there, on the technical side. If this isn't quite right, it is correct on the conceptual level, at least. So anytime you have that much money, that becomes an incredibly attractive target. So there are people working out there day and night to try and get that money. Anytime you write code via a smart contract, there are potential things out there that you don't necessarily expect that code to do. And I think as more and more people are writing smart contracts, we also have teams of auditors that are doing the same thing to try and find exploits in those codes and fix it before hackers can access it. So there's those sort of levels that I think of. Okay, how can we better protect the individual? Okay, well, that's a combination of education and better user interfaces. Okay, how can we protect people on the system-wide level? Well, that's about rectifying past exploits and making sure that they don't happen again. So again, education, but building safety features into these smart contracts. But it's also about thinking, well, how can we make these less appealing targets in the first place, or less accessible targets?
Interesting. So all world out there as well in this space. And Nelson, so looking a little bit here into the future, you already gave lots of examples, but what about the potential application or use cases that you anticipate for DAOs down the road?
So I would like to see more bridges with the physical world. One of the things that I think we need more of society is acting locally rather than globally. The people who interact most on the local level are us. I would like to see more co-ops, so cooperatives emerging, where we decide what we're going to do in our local areas. I don't think the way that we're operating as a society right now is the best way, and I don't think it's sustainable. And what we're seeing with the rise of remote work is less of a need for us all to be in cities. We saw this mass migration from, you know, the agricultural old world to this new world of industrialization, and everyone piled into cities because there was no choice, really. That was where the economic opportunities are. Now that's not the case. I would like to see kind of not necessarily people leaving the cities, but not necessarily feeling the need that they have to leave their town or their village if they want to create a life there. So economic opportunities, I think, are going to proliferate through DAOs and through Web3 communities because, you know, they're online digital organizations. All you need is an internet connection, and more of the world has an internet connection as of today.
It is very interesting. It is leveraging the technology to bring people back to areas and locals that are unpopulated at the moment. And
yeah,
that
I feel on that note as well, I feel more people need to be involved in decision making in the things that they care about. It's not necessarily that they need to be the ones making the decisions all the time, but they need the ability to either take those decisions themselves or choose how to delegate those decisions to people that they trust. And they need ways of, if that person violates that trust, of removing that decision-making power from them and reallocating it to someone else. And that's one of the things that we're working on in the Web3 ecosystem right now. So it might not be that you need to, in terms of the local example, you need to decide, you know, that we're going to go and fix this playground, or that more local shops should be available, or whatever that is. But you should have the ability of saying, okay, these are the people within our community that we trust to do that. This is how we're recording the decisions. This is how we're ensuring transparency. And this is how we're ensuring accountability.
So I don't resist. So definitely my mind is going to a political element as well here, right? This could as well disrupt some of the processes we have currently in our societies.
Yeah, personally, I hope so. I don't necessarily want to make this kind of a political conversation, because politics for some people means a specific thing. But really, for me, in the context of this conversation, politics, it should be a way of ensuring that society moves forward in a way that benefits the most people and protects those. It's about decision making. It's about debate. Exactly. And I don't think politics these days means that.
I hear.
So I don't necessarily want to label it politics and get down that road. But in terms of people deciding
active participation,
active participation, 100%.
That's really great, and it can work as well for the inclusion of, for example, empowered or marginalized communities, for example. Nelson, in the third season of this the Cruzamento podcast, we talk about technology, health, and sustainability, looking at the intersection of those. And I think we've kind of touched upon some of these aspects. But what do you think we are doing today that will have a very positive impact in the next 10 years?
So one of the most kind of interesting areas right now is regenerative finance and public goods funding. So what we've found is that public goods have traditionally been, I don't want to say ignored, but not given their fair due and not put the right level of importance on them. What we mean by public goods is goods that everybody uses, but that no one party is necessarily responsible for. And if you're familiar with kind of the tragedy of the commons, with that saying, it's essentially that if there's something that everybody uses and nobody is responsible for, eventually some people will take advantage of that. Others will see other people taking advantage of that and think it's the right thing to do, or think that they won't be punished for it. And it's a way of saying, no, we need to step back, and these things are really, really important, and we need to make sure that they're taken care of. We need to make sure that they're stewarded, and we need to make sure that they're well funded, because they're really important for all of us. Organizations like Gitcoin are doing a really, really fantastic job of making sure that these kind of programs or campaigns or initiatives that might normally get overlooked because they're not profitable, they have no necessarily business model at the heart of them, but nevertheless are incredibly important for a well-functioning society, are actually taken care of.
Wow. Nelson, thank you so much. We would like to thank you, of course, for your time and availability. So today we talk with Nelson Jordan about DAOs, what the topic, and he gave us lots of examples in several industries, from healthcare, as well as how this can contribute for inclusion, and how DAO is responsible to put someone in the space. So just the sky is the limit. Maybe the very last question, Nelson. In case our audience want to know more about you or follow your activity, where can they find you online?
Sure. So probably the best place is Twitter. You can find me at Nelson T. Jordan, or you can find out more about what we're doing at Avenue Place. We'd love to see you around. If you want to know more about Web3 or DAOs, there are no stupid questions. Please find me and ask away.
Nelson, thank you. Thank you very much. For our listeners and those that are watching us on YouTube, you can also find us on our website, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and all podcast applications. You can find all this information and more in our show notes. We also invite you to subscribe to our newsletter. And bye for now. Thank you very much for everyone that has listened and watches. We hope to see you very soon for more episodes of Cruzamento Podcast. Thank you very much.
See you soon.